Let me first start with recruitment and what are the recruitment practices in these schools. One of the things that is important to understand about how institutions make their money is they make their money through tuition. Tuition requires new students to come in, and so a very important part of the business model is how these institutions go about recruiting new students. So maybe I'll turn it over to Suzanne or Kathleen to talk a little bit from their experience what it was like working in that area of for-profits.
Sure. Well, first of all, when we first come into training as a recruiter, we're given extensive training and role-playing in specific tactics to use when we're on the phone with a student or lead, as they're called on the floor. And it starts with our title. We're called the Assistant Director of Admissions. And they actually tell us in training to try to make that student imagine the mahogany desk, you know, in the brick and mortar school, and the covered in ivy, and the books behind us, and try to create that image for them. When in reality, I was one of 1,000 assistant directors of admissions in a building the size of a football field filled with cubicles. So the deception begins immediately. And your next goal on the phone with a student is you ask them why they want to go to school. And you dig deeper and deeper, and you don't accept whatever answer they're giving until you get something so deeply personal that then you can throw that in their face when they eventually back out. And some of the things examples of these personal things in training, the trainers would give us, would things be like, so it sounds like your father isn't proud of you because your brother went to college, but you never did. So then when that student stops returning your calls or just tries to get off the phone with you, you say, oh, I'm confused. Do you not care what your father thinks anymore? Is that not important to you? And these are the things, I mean, this isn't just one wild example. These are role plays done in training. We're trained to do that. And the deception just continues to go, like things like, you know, we're told actually the phrase always be closing is told to us, which, I mean, we've heard that before, right? That's in a movie. But it was totally unironic, not joking, always be closing. Students are referred to as leads. You know, never give the full price. Like when you're taking them on the campus tour online while you're on the phone with them, you have a tuition screen and you say our credit is $500 per credit hour. Each class is 3 credit hours. And then you immediately divert them some way. Look at this class list. Which one are you most excited about taking? Tell me about that.
Good, thanks. We can come up with more of that later. Kathleen, do you want to add something?
I think the most important thing that I can say here at this point in time is that I began my career as a admissions counselor at Argosy University several years before Suzanne did, and I was taught exactly the same things. I could just sit here and say ditto, ditto, ditto. All of the same things were the way that I was trained. I can add one more unbelievable example. I was witness to a manager training their team in overcoming the death objection. In other words, you call a student up, they've decided they're not going to take the classes. The reason is because grandma just died. And they were role-playing over how would you handle that? Well, wouldn't grandma want you to go to school? Wouldn't grandma be looking down from heaven and so pleased that you were going to college? So it was not about what was right for the individual, it was about getting them through the door. They used to call it asses in classes, and that's the way they looked at it. It was a head count. It was nothing more than that. It wasn't about the benefit of the student. It was about, bottom line, the number of the dollars of people that you could get through the door.
Sure, yes, please.
I want to make a couple of comments here. One, I think we all understand what is being described here is a very commercial sales environment. Now, you can have any title you like, but when you walk into a car dealership, none of us is confused as to what kind of an encounter we're having, right? We're having a commercial encounter, and we instinctively, as consumers who grew up in a society where that happens all the time, we have our defenses up as to how we ought to behave. So one of the acts of deception is the labeling of the encounter as an admissions encounter, when in fact it is a sales encounter. If there is one non-negotiable marker from the Admissions Association perspective for what the business is supposed to be all about, that would be the notion that admissions is counseling work, right? I mean, when you go to the doctor, you all understand you're paying the doctor, but you also have every reasonable expectation that the doctor has an obligation, an ethical obligation to dispense advice in your best interest, not in the interest of the practice necessarily. Now, I don't know how well we succeed in general. Obviously, I think Professor James' point is correct. There are lots of practices in higher ed, including a director of admissions at a traditional school who brings in nobody for the next incoming class is not going to have that title for long. So yes, success is a component of our success of our measurement of ability in traditional higher ed, but it's not the end all and be all, and that's one of the issues. The second issue to point out is that if you go back and look at what happened to for-profit higher education, you're from Mars, you don't know anything about any of this, and you want a marker of what happened historically, you can trace the ticker marks for these companies over time, and you will note that the early 2000s seemed to be something transformative happened. The stocks took off, and one wonders why that happened. Well, one of the reasons it happened was that we have an administration that was very friendly to the industry, which actually, and this is the price of winning elections, right? I mean, you get to have policies you favor come into effect. So the sector had long chafed under a restriction that was imposed in the early 90s as a result of the corruption that was exposed in the non-hearings in the early 90s. It was a regulation that said you may not directly or indirectly compensate admissions representatives for success in recruiting. In other words, no commission sales. This was federal law. When the Bush administration came in, it directly targeted that provision, and despite the clarity of the language, you may not compensate people involved in recruitment or packaging of students, Congress said directly or indirectly. The Bush administration managed to carve out 12 loopholes in that clear congressional ban, and I mean, some of them really exceed your imagination, that, for example, you could reset salaries every 6 months and call it a salary, not a commission. And that's one of the ways in which, of course, the commercial encounters that were just described happened.
Just one thing, just to be clear, what he's talking about, for those of you who might be following the policy, these are the safe harbors, incentive compensation safe harbors. These are policies that were the safe harbors were eliminated, were removed last year through a new policy regime for the federal government. So there are no longer these safe harbors that allowed institutions to compensate recruiters as it was previously under the revisions from 2002. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about the racialized aspect of the recruitment, also the class-based aspect of the recruitment. For-profits cater to a niche population, low-income, minority students, first-generation students, veterans. These are students who have felt marginalized at traditional institutions. Often they're not prepared for the academic work there, but also the classes are not flexible enough. They don't have time to lounge on the college green for 4 years. They have families and children that they need to take care of. And in some ways, for-profits have been responsive to this, laudably. So being more flexible regarding when classes are scheduled, or being able to have online offerings. And so for-profits, they know this. They know that these students have felt marginalized at other institutions, and they're catering to it. But the recruitment takes on really distasteful aspects. A lot of the advertisements are very racialized, so actors will sort of try to invoke black. If you've seen the commercials, you know what I'm talking about. Actors will try to sort of invoke black culture by using speech or phonetic conventions or particular dress to sort of draw a particular population in. Some scholars would say that this is discrimination against protective groups, and there's conversations about that. And so, we might say it's good that for-profits are trying to attract students who are being ignored by nonprofits, and nonprofits really have to get on the ball about making these students feel welcome at their institutions. But at the same time, we have to think about the nature of this recruitment, and we have to take a step back. When people say, well, a lot of the defense of the for-profit industry has been these students are not served elsewhere, it's good that we're serving them, and not everyone can have a 4-year elite education at Harvard. But when we see the same segments of population being lured into educations that are not giving them long-term benefits, when it's always veterans, when it's always minority students, when it's always low-income students, we have to wonder, this is not just about, well, everyone can't have the same experience. At some point it becomes hypocrisy. And we're okay with a particular segment of the population having a subpar experience and being really preyed upon or being exploited, right, based on their personal experiences, and being okay with the rest of the population not being subject to this sort of experience.